and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-Jung Cho. Since the June 12th Singapore summit, there were revelations about a secret uranium enrichment facility and secret missile operating bases. How many more hidden sites are out there? Will North Korea come clean about these facilities and put them on the declaration list?
We have observed fabrication of reactor components and possible transfer of these components into the reactor.
In the studio with me today, Ms. Olivia Enos, policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation. Ms. Enos is an Asia specialist and focuses her research on human rights and national security. Also joining me today, Mr. David Albright, president of the Institute for Science and International Security. Mr. Albright is a physicist, was involved in Track 2 discussions with North Korea, and advises governments on denuclearization. Welcome to the program.
Oh, good to be here.
Thank you. Mr. Albright, you first revealed about the Kangson secret uranium enrichment facility, also known as Kangson. So how is this Kangson facility important in the overall North Korean nuclear program?
One of the big mysteries of North Korea is how many nuclear weapons they have. And this enrichment plant can make a nuclear explosive material called highly enriched uranium. And we just don't know how much they can make. And intelligence agencies, first based on defector information, but then added to, concluded that North Korea has other uranium enrichment plants that it hasn't declared. And Kaesong is a leading candidate for that. So
is Kangson, some say it's twice the capacity of Yongbyon.
Well, there's a debate. I mean, I discussed this with 3 governments, and they understood that I was going to make it public. There is actually debate, and one government, a close ally, doesn't think it's an enrichment plant. The U.S. tends to have the highest estimate. They think it has 12,000 of these what are called gas centrifuges. Another government that's actually probably more expert in these gas centrifuges thinks it could be 6,000.
So other than Kangson, is there another uranium or nuclear facility? Some say a facility is at Hamhung. What are your thoughts?
Well, there's many other undeclared nuclear sites. They make nuclear weapons someplace. We think they make thermonuclear material. They've said they have H-bombs. So there's a lot of undeclared sites. And these are all outside of this main nuclear site called Yongbyon that attracts a lot of the public attention. And so North Korea has a pretty robust nuclear weapons production complex with many secret sites. And it's hard. I mean, we have a list of other sites we could release. But what's the point? I mean, really, in the end, we need North Korea to come forth and tell us what they've got.
What about other missile sites, Olivia?
Yes, so I think that there are a lot of sites that we don't necessarily know about. There are some that our intelligence facilities definitely do know about, regardless of whether it's an undisclosed missile site or an undisclosed nuclear site. This tells us something about North Korea's intentionality when it came to the negotiating table in Singapore. I was in Singapore, and ahead of the summit, there were a lot of expectations that maybe this was going to be the beginning of a really substantive process moving toward denuclearization. But since that time, we've continued to see North Korea developing its nuclear and missile capabilities, and that in and of itself calls into question North Korea's sincerity in negotiations.
So, Olivia, some of these information were also leaked by U.S. US government officials. So is this a way of pressuring North Korea to be honest in negotiations?
I think, the United States definitely has a maximum pressure strategy toward North Korea, and that includes sanctions, that includes criticizing North Korea on human rights grounds, and it may also include talking about some of these facilities that we don't have as much information about. But as David referenced, this is why it's so critical that we ask North Korea to give that data declaration as a first step so that they can demonstrate that they're coming to the table with sincerity, willing to tell us what it is that they have, and then actually put in place these verifiable steps that we can certify means that they're moving toward denuclearization.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Albright, do you also agree that having a declaration from North Korea from get-go is very important?
Yeah, but it'd be an initial declaration. I mean, the way, and this is a process that's been developed over 5 decades. What North Korea needs to do initially is kind of give a lay of the land. It doesn't have to reveal where it stores nuclear weapons. It doesn't have to give all the intricate details, but it has to be able to open up its program so we will know approximately how many nuclear weapons they have, where all these things, the components and materials are made, and then you could move into a step where you're getting a full declaration and you're getting the steps in place so you can do the adequate verification. And this has been done before. I mean, North Korea has revealed a lot on its plutonium program. We know that pretty well. During the six-party talks in the 2000s, they in their declaration, because it got to the declaration stage, they revealed 15,000 pages of operating data for the 5 megawatt electric reactor at Yongbyon. Where it stalled was when the inspectors had come up with a very clever way to verify total plutonium production by North Korea and then check it against the North Korean declaration. They just needed to take some samples. It wouldn't have taken that long, and North Korea refused, and the whole 6-party process broke down. So we have experience with this. North Korea's done the things necessary to make this work. It's just refusing to do it now, and it's trying to limit things to Yongbyon and the plutonium program, and that's just not enough. We need the uranium enrichment program included in these negotiations and discussions.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Albright just mentioned about Yongbyon. Olivia, so North Korea offers to dismantle Dongchangri and also Yongbyon if there is U.S.'s corresponding steps. So what are your take about these a piecemeal approach by North Korea?
So I think a piecemeal approach is really reflective of a broader strategy that North Korea has taken, not just in this negotiating phase, but also in past negotiating phases during 6-party talks and otherwise. And it's really an attempt by them, I think, to play hard to get. Many analysts who study North Korea's nuclear program have said that Yongbyon was perhaps the easiest part of the nuclear program for North Korea to sacrifice, not really a huge sacrifice at all, because it's already developed significant capabilities that sort of go beyond Yongbyon. And the same thing with Dongchangri, because North Korea has moved beyond using these sort of set locations for the missile launch sites to more of mobile missile launch sites. And Sohae is the former rather than the latter. And so we see Kim Jong-un at the beginning of the year saying, we've already developed these advanced capabilities. So we basically don't need to be testing anymore. So a lot of the things that they're claiming to be a big sacrifice really don't seem to be that much of a sacrifice at all.
Yeah, and one test of their sincerity is in its 6-party talks in 2000, the United States wanted to go to the test site and take environmental samples of radioactive debris. You'd have to drill into the mountain to do it. Because North Korea declared we used 2 kilograms of plutonium in the test that they did in 2006. So that you want to verify that. You can drill in, take a sample, and find out. North Korea refused in the 6-party talks to do that. They should be expected to allow the inspectors to do that now. There's now 6 tests where you'd have to drill in. But it's a process that the U.S. and other governments know well because they have studied nuclear weapons so intensively.
So what North Korea is offering to invite inspectors into Punggye-ri, which it already dismantled by itself. So is there any significance in sending inspectors to a site already dismantled by North Korea?
Well, if they can take these samples, if they can drill into the mountain or find another way to get the samples of the radioactive debris from the nuclear explosions, it would be immensely valuable. I mean, we don't even know if they use highly enriched uranium in nuclear weapons. We have no concrete evidence.
You initially said there will be 100 weapons by 2020. Do you still hold that estimate?
Well, that was an assessment that I was asked to do to scope out future possibilities. I did this, I don't know, 3-4 years ago. And that estimate was matched by another estimate that said they would only have 20. And so that was the upper bound estimate of if North Korea just went full out. And for example, they're building a little light water reactor at Yongbyon. When I was in Pyongyang in 2011, they tried to convince me they would operate that by 2013. And so if they had managed to do that, they would have been making a lot of new plutonium in that reactor that could be for weapons. And so this 100 was really an upper bound. Our current estimates are more in the range of 15 to 35, that they've come down as time has progressed. And it gets to a central principle that we see over and over again in nuclear weapons programs. There's probably less there than you think based on the statement of the country, that they often will go to great lengths to in a sense, convince you they have more. It's actually hard to make these nuclear weapons and to make them reliably and to just make all the weapon-grade uranium or highly enriched uranium and plutonium.
So these revelations of these secret sites. So in Washington, D.C., Olivia, do you think there is a growing suspicion that North Korea may not be so sincere in giving up its weapons?
I mean, I think most folks in Washington were really skeptical, even going into the Singapore summit, that North Korea would be sincere. And I think since that time, there hasn't been the necessary progress that maybe some expected coming out of that. I think President Trump acknowledges that. I think Secretary Pompeo acknowledges that. And I think it's most revealed through the closed-door meetings, which are in fact far more important than any sort of public meeting like Singapore was. And those behind closed doors meetings between Secretary Pompeo and Kim Jong-un and other North Korean officials and U.S. government officials seem to not be going very well. And so I think it's going to be really interesting to look forward to this next year where President Trump has said, well, maybe we're going to have a Singapore Summit 2.0 and a meeting between Trump and Kim Jong-un that might come up in the future. And I think that this would be a huge mistake because Singapore Summit in and of itself granted legitimacy to a regime that never really ever made promises that demonstrated a verifiable intent to denuclearize. And I don't think that they should be rewarded for the fact that very few steps have been taken in order to actually move toward denuclearization. And beyond that, it looks like they're continuing to develop these types of facilities.
So, Mr. Albright, I think the key question that we have is how long will it really take for North Korea to denuclearize? Like Kim Jong-un says within President Trump's first term, and whereas Dr. Siegfried Hecker says it's going to take 15 years. What are your take?
We've done studies. For example, we've done them for governments that have asked us to look at this. And we've looked at other cases. I mean, with all due respect to Dr. Hecker, he's never been involved in an inspection effort. And so if you look at actual cases in Iraq and South Africa, even other countries, Brazil gave up a program, you can design it so denuclearization can happen in 2 years, 2 to 3 years, but the country has to cooperate. And when Dr. Hecker and his colleagues talk about these numbers like 10 years, what they're doing is they're saying we're going to do this piecemeal. They won't even get to important parts of the program for 5-6 years. So I think if you actually took what they were saying, took it apart, said how long would it take if we did it all together, it's probably not that much different. Because in the end, if North Korea cooperates, 3-4 months you can write a declaration, a detailed declaration. So you get an initial one, 3 to 4 months to write a detailed one. You need maybe almost a year to verify the declaration. And then the dismantlement, for a lot of it isn't that hard. It takes a week to take apart a nuclear weapon. You can take apart several at a time if you design or use the facilities effectively. You do it in North Korea. It's harder to get rid of a reactor, so you're going to have to kind of disable it. I mean, the radioactive material makes it impossible to just take it apart right away. But technically, it's been done. You know how to do it. It can be done in a couple years, but it could take that long to get a negotiated agreement. I mean, things are moving so slowly. But I think it's a real mistake to do it piecemeal. I mean, the verification is much harder. If we just do plutonium, You don't have any idea how the plutonium is used in nuclear weapons. Is it used alone, or is it used in conjunction with weapon-grade or highly enriched uranium? And so you can't do any serious verification if you don't have a sense of the whole program. And we also know that from other cases.
Yeah.
You get the whole program, verification happens very quickly.
Right. So my last question, I want both your opinions. So considering these secret sites, what can the U.S. do to not repeat past mistakes in negotiation with North Korea?
I think the U.S. has to acknowledge who exactly it is that we're dealing with. Kim Jong-un and his father and grandfather have historically not been honest with the U.S. when it's come to nuclear negotiations. They have played hard to get. And so I think that that's why it's so important that we put in place measures that ensure complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of North Korea's nuclear program with really strong emphasis on that verifiable bit. I think that we have to be getting specific with North Korea and telling them that we can't keep coming to the negotiating table and coming back with nothing. We need to start seeing forward progress and forward movement. And in my mind, that includes significant inspections being allowed by U.S. inspectors or IAEA as a first course, and hopefully a data declaration and a full data declaration at some point in the near future.
Yeah, I think one is to learn from the past. I mean, we've gone through this multiple times with North Korea. We need to do it in a holistic way. That's number one lesson, and the Trump administration and South Korean government should let experience guide this, not politics. We know how to do it. The other is don't take away the sanctions. I would argue to increase the sanctions right now, to perhaps target some Chinese companies that are continuing to do business with North Korea. We see it in the nuclear side, and it would be very interesting to ramp up the pressure a little bit on North Korea in a kind of in a surgical way.
Well, we'll leave it here and watch video for our next discussion.
That human rights violations and abuses must stop, and that those responsible should be held accountable.
North Korean diplomats and the state media accused Washington of stoking confrontation. The move comes after the UN Third Committee passed a resolution condemning North Korea's human rights violations. Now, the U.S. is calling for a North Korea human rights meeting at the UN Security Council next month. Why is the United States pushing for this?
I think that this meeting is an incredibly important one, particularly since it seems like human rights issues largely fell off the face of the negotiating table since Singapore. And I think that this is a really important meeting, not only because the U.S. is taking the lead on this, but because it's going to send, hopefully, a unifying message from the international community that the human rights abuses taking place in North Korea are worse than almost anything taking place in the modern day world. I think that the U.S. is coming to the table because this was a priority for President Trump early on. After the death of Otto Warmbier, we saw, of course, at the State of the Union address, Ji Sung-ho, the North Korean refugee who was featured there, and even the president's previous talks in South Korea before the National Assembly raising the human rights issues.
So I think people are left to wonder, is United States pushing for human rights because the denuclearization talks are not going well? Is human rights something that is so linked to talks with North Korea, do you think?
So I think that human rights issues in and of themselves have value and should be raised because it's in the American spirit to promote freedom and human rights for people all across the globe. But I think that the U.S. recognizes that North Korea is a really unique case where the human rights issues and the national security issues are directly interlinked. They are able to maintain their grip on power. And the maintenance of their grip on power is in many ways what legitimizes the existence of the nuclear missile program. Beyond that, things like free labor in prison camps is free labor for the regime. those individuals in the prison camps have been found to be providing free labor for the nuclear and missile programs. And there have even been reports of individuals inside these prison camps having chemical and biological weapons tested on them. So I think actually addressing the human rights issues and viewing them as a part of the nuclear negotiations can be an important tactic. And I think the UN Security Council resolution, which was incredibly welcome, and the future meeting is a symbol of that.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Albright, you were involved in negotiations with North Korea, especially in 2012, the Leap Day Agreement. So what is your take? How should we proceed both human rights and denuclearization?
Well, it's a really tough issue, and it's very hard to in negotiations to link them, and I think probably in these negotiations, if they are successful, they will not be linked directly. I mean, as Olivia said, the human rights situation in North Korea is really dire. I mean, you feel it when you're there, and that the United States has to find a way to move forward on that. I think in the actual negotiations of a nuclear deal, it's extremely hard to actually put in. Now, what you can do is if there's a UN Security Council resolution that's created sort of to kind of be overarching on the nuclear negotiated results, you could then put in human rights there and put in conditions that are created independent of North Korea.
Mm-hmm. What do you think? It should be separate or bring it directly to the denuclearization table?
I think that you actually can bring the issues together, and there are a couple of ways that I think this is possible. One is that one of the things that North Korea is really seeking is sanctions relief. And the reality is that the way that our current U.S. sanctions are established, especially the North Korea Sanctions and Policy Enhancement Act, in order for those sanctions to be lifted, which they're among the toughest sanctions on North Korea, it's required that North Korea make progress on political prison camps in particular. And in order to lift them entirely, they actually have to close those political prison camps. And so I think that actually you can link these issues together by saying, North Korea, we can lift sanctions on you, but actually legally we can't lift all of the sanctions until you also make forward progress in this area. And this is true also under the Obama administration. There was an executive order that specifically listed Kim Jong-un and 10 other North Koreans and 10 North Korean entities on human rights related grounds. And so if North Korea wants to be free of these sanctions once and for all, then I think you also have to put pressure on the human rights front. I think in addition to that, we saw prior to the Singapore summit, one of the conditions was the release of the 3 Americans, which was a human rights issue. And I think a lot of people were nervous that maybe North Korea would back away from the negotiating table at that point. But I actually think that the release of the 3 Americans should embolden U.S. negotiators to raise the human rights issue more, because it didn't completely close the door on negotiations. We still went forward with the summit in Singapore and are continuing to talk with North Korea today. So I think that there are different ways that it can be linked.
I think what Olivia said about the U.S. sanctions, I think, is incredibly important, because one of the mistakes in the Iran nuclear deal was too many of the U.S. sanctions were taken away that are really needed to address, in the case of Iran, human rights or terrorism and missiles. And so I think it's important to design a negotiating strategy where the United States will lift some U.S. sanctions, but by no means all of them.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll leave it here and move on to our next segment. Now, time for the photo moment. Time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today's picture shows a mask of Chairman Kim Jong-un for sale at a costume shop in Maryland just before Halloween last month. You can also easily get a variety of different Kim Jong-un masks on Amazon. Kim Jong-un mask is also reportedly a Halloween favorite in Britain as well.
I think, unlike his father and grandfather, he's trying to have an international image that's friendly, and it is certainly he's a dictator. The other part of it, though, is in dealing with North Korea, you really do have to realize that he's like a god inside. I mean, I understand what he does, but it's important not to belittle him, because it can have very negative impacts in how they will respond.
I mean, it is important to remember the character and nature of Kim Jong-un. This is a pretty evil guy who has done a lot of really horrible things to his people, and also potentially does threaten the U.S. with his nuclear and missile program. So hard to make too much light of him for sure.
Yeah.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Mr. Albright, Ms. Enos, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eunjang Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.